Hey everyone! Tonight we are diving into one of the most incredible, almost unbelievable contrasts in human history. You know the history books, right? They paint a picture of European dominance. Columbus, Magellan, Drake, these great bearded white men conquering the high seas. But I want you to mentally scrap that image for a second. I want you to picture two distinct sets of people existing simultaneously, thousands of miles apart, navigating their worlds. On one side, you see a small, open canoe knot, some protected galleon, but two sleek hulls lashed together with cordage barely above the waterline, cutting through the heavy swells of the open Pacific. On that canoe, you are navigating purely by memory. You are tracking the way the wind feels on your left ear. You're reading the subtle, refracted patterns of wave action bouncing off islands hundreds of miles away, and you're relying on the flight path of a lonely seabird to confirm your direction. You are hours, days, weeks from any known land deep in the largest body of water on the planet, heading toward a target island that is literally a speck maybe 10 miles wide in an area of ocean the size of North America. You are a Polynesian voyager, and this is just another Tuesday. Now, at the exact same point in history, perhaps in the year 800 AD or even 1200 AD, we look over to Europe. You are standing on the coast of Spain or Portugal. You see your own ships, heavy square-rigged cogs or small, shallow-drafted galleys. Your sailors hug the coastline. Their greatest fear is sailing out of sight of land because their navigation systems are rudimentary there. Understanding of the globe is incomplete and often mythological, and their vessels are simply not built to withstand the sustained, unpredictable fury of the open Atlantic. They are masters of the Mediterranean, beautiful.com, historically navigable inland sea. But put them a few hundred miles west of Gibraltar, and they are terrified. Their world ends where the horizon meets the great unknown ocean. This is the Pacific paradox. One culture, the Polynesian, mastered deep-ocean expansion and colonized a territory larger than any empire ever conceived, scattering themselves across millions of square miles of sea, reaching the remote corners of New Zealand, Hawaii, and Easter Island. Meanwhile, their European counterparts, who would later claim global maritime superiority, were still nervously sailing from Lisbon to Bordeaux, constantly checking the coastline over their shoulder. The Europeans were huggers. They hugged the coasts and the familiar waters. The Polynesians were sprawlers. They treated the ocean itself as the great unifying highway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe button. Only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sheer scale of this contrast is what makes the deep dive necessary. It's easy to dismiss this as simply a difference in geography, but it's deeper than that. It's a difference in philosophy and technology. The mainstream historical fact here is the dating. The major Polynesian expansion, which brought people to remote islands like Hawaii and Rapa Nui, Easter Island, largely occurred between 300 AD and 1250 AD. This puts the Polynesian zenith of oceanic exploration firmly in the European early to high Middle Ages, a time when European sailors considered the Atlantic a vast, monster-filled, insurmountable barrier. Think about what it takes to launch a successful colonization voyage, not just a fishing trip. You need reliable boats, obviously. You need a massive amount of planning, because if you miss that speck of land, you and your entire future society are food for the sharks. But most of all, you need a different cultural mindset. You need a people who view the water, not the land, as their home. The quirky tidbit here is how they found those specks. You know how sailors today have maps and satellites? Polynesian navigators sometimes relied on cloud formations. When a cloud hovers over a low-lying island, the warm, moist air rising from the landmass hits the cloud base and creates a slightly different color or shape, a slight lensing effect on the underside of the cloud than the clouds over the deep, cold ocean. If you had the trained eye of a Polynesian navigator, you could spot this subtle telltale sign, this island signature, perhaps 40 or 50 miles away, guiding you toward your destination long before the land itself breached the horizon. It's like finding a needle in a haystack by seeing the subtle atmospheric distortion caused by the needle's shadow. Now, to the open scholarly debate, historians still argue whether the final phases of Polynesian exploration, particularly the voyages to New Zealand out of Roa, were primarily motivated by deliberate exploration or by resource exhaustion and internal conflict on existing smaller islands? Was it the adventurous spirit of the chief that drove the canoes, or the practical necessity of finding new land to feed a burgeoning population? The answer is likely both, but the debate informs our understanding of just how necessary oceanic travel became for their society's survival. They weren't just sailing for fun, they were sailing for continuation. And as you picture yourself on that European ship, nervously keeping the Spanish coast in view, notice the contrast in scale. You're worried about running into a sandbar or a localized storm. You are still dealing with the legacy of the Roman Empire, which used the Mediterranean for trade and conquest, but never truly pushed out into the deep Atlantic with any sustained effort. The vast difference in risk assessment is key. The Polynesians accepted the risk of the unknown ocean because their technology and skill mitigated that risk sufficiently to make the endeavor worthwhile. The Europeans, on the other hand, saw the Atlantic as a geometric progression of risk. The further you went, the exponentially more dangerous and less profitable the journey became. Their world was not configured for deep travel yet, and as we sail past the coast and into the next section, we'll look at the specific geography that nurtured this European timidity. You'll see why the Mediterranean was both their cradle and, paradoxically, their initial cage. As we leave the vast Pacific swells and mentally remoor ourselves to the shores of Europe, the difference in naval philosophy becomes instantly clear. You are standing on the ancient docks of Genoa or perhaps Alexandria, and you see the Mare Nostrum Sea, as the Romans called it, the Mediterranean. This is not an ocean, it's a bathtub, albeit a big one. It is crisscrossed by familiar trade routes, bounded by known cultures, and peppered with predictable islands. This is the European comfort zone. The greatest challenge the early European sailor faced was not the endless horizon, but piracy and intercity warfare. You were much more likely to lose your cargo to a Venetian rival or a Barbary corsair than to be swallowed by a mythical sea monster. This environment fostered a very specific kind of naval architecture and skill set. Ships were designed for cargo capacity, short bursts of speed, often relying on oarsmen for maneuverability, and most importantly, they needed to be capable of putting into port almost every night, or at least every few days. Long-term self-sufficiency was not a design priority because logistics were handled by established coastal networks. Think about the geography itself. If you sail from Italy, you hit Sicily, then North Africa, then Crete, then Greece. You are never truly isolated. The mainstream historical fact is that the ancient and medieval European nautical focus was overwhelmingly oar-driven and coastal. Even the great trading empires relied heavily on galleys, vessels highly dependent on the brute force of rowers. Galleys were magnificent fighting machines and fast transporters in calm seas, but they were utterly unsuited for the massive sustained waves and winds of the open Atlantic. They had minimal capacity for provisions, requiring frequent stops, and their low freeboard made them incredibly vulnerable to true ocean weather. This focus on the internal sea deeply affected European exploration. The skills you, as a medieval sailor, mastered were those of harbor maneuvering, reading local currents, and navigating by dead reckoning combined with familiar landmarks. Once you passed the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, you entered the Atlantic, and your skill set became suddenly, violently obsolete. The ocean was too deep for your traditional anchors, too vast for your coastal charts, and too tempestuous for your shallow draft hulls. The quirky tidbit that demonstrates this coastal hugging tendency relates to the tides. In the Mediterranean, the tides are minimal, sometimes only a foot or two. European sailors, until they began seriously engaging with the Atlantic, simply didn't develop sophisticated knowledge or techniques for dealing with massive tidal swings, which are crucial for safe navigation along oceanic coasts and estuaries. When early explorers did venture out into the Atlantic and encountered, say, the 7-meter tides of the Bay of Fundy or the British Channel, it was genuinely terrifying and often disastrous. Their comfort zone had excluded the most fundamental rhythm of the open ocean. Now, let's consider the psychological barrier. For centuries, the Atlantic was known as the Sea of Darkness. Medieval cartographers didn't just leave it blank, they filled it with monsters, whirlpools, and mythological boundaries. This was less about ignorance and more about the cultural affirmation of a known safe world. Sailing off the map wasn't just a technical challenge, it was an act of theological or social defiance. No king or merchant was going to invest heavily in ships designed to sail into a geographic and mythical abyss, when there were immediate, enormous profits to be made, trading silks and spices across the short, safe route to Constantinople. Historians still argue whether the key inhibitor to European oceanic expansion before the 15th century was primarily technological capability. The lack of the lateen sail and strong hulls, or socioeconomic incentive, was it that they couldn't build the right ships, or that they simply didn't need to when the Mediterranean was so lucrative and required a different kind of naval focus? The consensus leans toward the latter. The incentive structure of the feudal and mercantile systems strongly favored local, low-risk trade over high-risk, higher-word deep-ocean ventures. You, as a sailor in a cog sailing near Venice, wouldn't understand the mindset of a Polynesian preparing for a multi-generational voyage. You operate on a different timetable. Your voyage from port A to port B is measured in days, maybe a couple of weeks, not in months or years. Your goal is simply to deliver the cargo. You joke about a Polynesian trip being a vacation. You say, "My great-great Tranfart sailed to Cyprus." That's a good sail. The idea of sailing for months until you literally found an entirely new world, a world with no existing ports or repair facilities, would strike you as insane and unnecessary flirtation with poverty and death. Remember how the Polynesians used cloud signs? You, in the Mediterranean, use smoke signals from familiar lighthouses or the distinctive silhouette of a known coastal mountain range. If the weather obscures the land, you drop anchor and wait it out. You don't have the cultural compulsion or the naval resilience to simply keep going, trusting your non-instrumental skills. The European world taught its sailors to respect boundaries and rely on the familiar, while the Austronesian world, as we will explore next, taught its people to constantly breach those boundaries and redefine the familiar. It is the fundamental difference between building a life around the sea and building a life on the sea. To truly understand the Polynesian achievement, you have to rewind far back past the time of the Lapita potters, past the colonization of Fiji and Samoa, all the way to the Austronesian roots. You're not looking at a single historical event, but a millennial-long process of human dispersal that started in a seemingly unlikely place, the island of Taiwan. Around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, this is the first great leap, the genesis of the deep-ocean mastery. Imagine yourself on the south coast of Taiwan, around 3000 BCE, or part of a community speaking an early Austronesian language. The mainstream historical fact is that the archaeological and linguistic evidence strongly points to a rapid expansion southwards from Taiwan, through the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. This migration was not a slow creep across land bridges. It was maritime from the start. These weren't coastal fishermen who occasionally paddled out. These were people who had already engineered boats capable of carrying entire families, crops, and the knowledge needed to survive on islands they could only dimly imagine. This initial migration wave, known as the out-of-Taiwan theory, established a foundational culture that viewed the sea as the connector, not the barrier. They had no idea they were laying the groundwork for the eventual colonization of the farthest reaches of the Pacific. But every journey south and east built the necessary skill set, refined the boat design, and solidified the psychological preparedness for deep-ocean travel. You might joke that these early migrants were just really bad at farming and decided the grass was greener on the other side of the horizon. But in reality, population pressure and socio-political dynamics were powerful drivers. As these groups moved, they encountered and absorbed or displaced existing populations in places like New Guinea, leading to a rich blending of cultures, but maintaining the distinct Austronesian linguistic and technological package, which included sophisticated navigation and boat building. The crucial part of this history is that it established a continuous oceanic tradition. By the time the descendants of these migrants reached the edge of what we call Near Oceania, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, they already had thousands of years of successful deep-water navigation in their cultural DNA. Compare this to the European sailor, who, 3,000 years later, was still grappling with the basics of steering a square-rigged ship in heavy winds, struggling to innovate beyond the designs of the ancient Romans. The quirky tidbit here involves the domesticated animals they carried. Remember those portable ecosystems. The early Austronesians took with them the pig, the chicken, the dog, and the Pacific rat Rattus excellens. The rat, often an unintended stowaway, became an incredibly accurate, if unfortunate, archaeological marker. The sequence in which the Pacific rat arrived on various islands provides a concrete, datable timeline for the rapid succession of voyages, a furry little footprint marking the paths of the explorers across the sea. These rats were, unintentionally, the first wave of colonization's chroniclers. Historians still argue whether the propulsion for the earliest dispersal from Taiwan was primarily technological advancement. The perfection of the outrigger canoe and the triangular sail, or demographic expansion, driven by efficient agricultural practices, rice cultivation leading to population booms. The ability to grow crops like taro and yams, coupled with the ability to carry them, gave them a robust, self-sustaining colonization kit. It was a perfect storm of biological and technological readiness. Imagine yourself on one of these early vaca. The boat is light, fast, and stable, thanks to the outrigger feature that European ships would not effectively adopt for centuries. This outrigger is the secret sauce. While a European cog needs enormous heavy ballast to keep from rolling over, reducing its cargo space, and increasing its draft, your Austronesian canoe uses the simple, elegant engineering of the outrigger arm and float to achieve superior stability with minimal weight. If you tried to sail a Mediterranean galley across the open Pacific, you probably wouldn't survive this. That low freeboard, designed to let rowers easily dip their oars, would swamp in the first serious ocean swell. The Polynesian language itself reflects this mastery. There are dozens of words for wind, current, wave, and swell, each describing a specific state of the ocean, which is essential for navigation. Try explaining the difference between a groundswell and a wind swell to your European counterpart. He'd likely just shrug and call it bad weather. Your language, your culture, your entire existence is tailored to the sea. This initial movement from Taiwan set a crucial precedent. Voyaging was possible, repeatable, and culturally valued. It created an entire population base that viewed large bodies of water as temporary inconveniences separating fertile lands. This is the genetic foundation that led directly to the Lapita culture, which we'll look at next, and their rapid, unprecedented expansion across the remote islands of the Pacific. Leaving the European coast, huggers far, far behind, literally stuck in the mud of their continental mindset. The stage is set for the greatest demographic achievement in oceanic history. The story of oceanic mastery accelerates dramatically with the emergence of the Lapita culture. If the Austronesian expansion out of Taiwan was the slow, steady heartbeat of migration, the Lapita phenomenon was the sudden, powerful surge of blood through the system. Emerging in island Melanesia around 1600 BCE, the Lapita people are the direct, identifiable ancestors of the later Polynesians. You are now in the archipelago of Fiji or Tonga. Around 1000 BCE, what you see is a culture defined by two things: speed and pottery. The mainstream historical fact about Lapita is their truly astonishing rate of expansion. They leapfrogged thousands of miles of ocean in a few centuries. Moving from the Bismarck archipelago to Samoa in what seems archaeologically like the blink of an eye, this massive and rapid movement demonstrates an unparalleled confidence in deep-sea navigation. They weren't drifting, they were sailing with purpose and precision. Their distinctive pottery, from which the culture takes its name, is our best indicator of their movements. You recognize the beautiful, intricate, dento-testamped patterns. Small, toothed tools were used to press geometric designs into the clay. This pottery isn't just art, it's a technological marker. When you find a Lapita sherd, you know you are looking at the footprint of the people who mastered the void between near Oceania, the easily visible islands like New Guinea and the Solomons, and remote Oceania, the vast, sparsely scattered islands of Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. The shift from the Austronesian coastal hops to the Lapita open ocean leaps marks the moment when the Pacific became a true highway. Why the sudden acceleration? It wasn't just the boats, it was the complete societal package they carried. Remember the concept of the portable ecosystem? Lapita groups brought everything necessary to establish a fully functioning long-term colony. Taro, breadfruit, yam, coconut, chickens, pigs, and of course, the knowledge of how to cultivate them in a new environment. They weren't raiding or exploring, they were colonizing. We must now turn our attention to the unsung heroes of this entire historical phenomenon, the canoes. These are not just boats, they are sophisticated feats of naval architecture. Often underestimated by those accustomed to the massive steel-hulled ships of later eras, the Polynesian vaca, The double-hulled canoe, or the outrigger canoe, was the perfect technology for the specific task of long-distance colonization in the Pacific. You stand on a beach in what is now Samoa, watching a master shipwright at work. He is using tools made of basalt, coral, and shell, yet the hull he is shaping is long, sleek, and incredibly strong. The mainstream historical fact is that the largest Polynesian voyaging canoes could exceed 25 meters over 80 feet in length and carry dozens of people, their animals, and tons of provisions. This is a massive vessel, yet it is orders of magnitude lighter and faster than any contemporary European cog or galley of similar capacity. The genius is in the double hull design. Instead of a single, deep, heavy hull that requires ballast and is prone to rolling violently in heavy seas, the Polynesian approach distributes the load and achieves phenomenal stability. The two hulls, lashed together by a massive cross-platform, create a natural rigidity. This platform is where life happens: cooking, sleeping, socializing, and tending to the portable ecosystem. It is a floating village, not just a conveyance. The lashing itself is a marvel of engineering. They used cordage woven from coconut fiber senet, which is incredibly strong but, crucially, possesses a degree of elasticity. This elasticity means the hull joints are not rigidly fixed. They can flex and give under the enormous stress of open ocean waves, distributing the shock rather than snapping. A European ship, relying on rigid iron nails and timbers, would start to leak or break up under that constant flexing stress. The Polynesian canoe was designed to breathe with the ocean. Contrast this with your European contemporary, nervously hugging the Portuguese coast. That vessel relies on heavy timber and metal fastenings. If that ship is caught in a massive Atlantic storm, the stress on the fixed joints and planking often leads to catastrophic failure. It sinks because it resists the sea, whereas the Vaca survives because it accepts and flows with the sea. The quirky tidbit concerning the Vaca is the temporary hull repairs. If a hull was damaged mid-voyage, the navigators carried specific plant materials and techniques to effectively create a temporary patch, often using masticated breadfruit sap or other sticky plant resins bound with fiber, all while riding the waves. They didn't need a blacksmith or a shipyard to fix a breach. They just needed the raw materials they carried or found. This self-reliance in the middle of the ocean speaks volumes about the advanced nature of their preparation. Historians still argue whether the primary technological leap that enabled the final, most extreme voyages to Hawaii and New Zealand was the adoption of the crab claw sail, or the central steering board. The crab claw sail, a beautifully efficient triangular Layton-like rig, could be much larger than a European square sail of the era, allowing for faster speeds and the ability to sail much closer to the wind-upwind capability. The steering board, inserted into the lee side of the hull, acted as a dynamic rudder and keel, allowing the canoe to be quickly adjusted and stabilized. You, the European sailor, are stuck with your heavy sperrig. A square sail is great if the wind is blowing exactly where you want to go downwind. But if you need to beat into the wind to sail against the prevailing direction, you are utterly ineffective. You are forced to wait for a favorable wind shift. The Polynesian navigator, using the efficient crab claw sail, could tack and maneuver into the wind, greatly expanding his accessible sailing area and his ability to correct for drift. This is why the Polynesians could achieve intentional two-way voyages, the defining feature of true oceanic mastery. They weren't setting off and hoping to land, they were setting off with the intention of reaching Island X, documenting its location through oral memory and potentially returning home later. This required a level of navigational and technological confidence that was simply non-existent in Europe until centuries later, when the Portuguese perfected the caravel, a vessel whose success was largely due to incorporating the high-performance triangular Latin sail design. Principle the Polynesians had already mastered millennia earlier. You probably wouldn't survive this trip on a leaky, rudderless squarriger, but on a double-hulled Vaca, you feel an astonishing sense of stability and purpose, an elegant harmony between wood, fiber, and the sea. Having marveled at the Polynesian Vaca, it's only fair to spend a moment genuinely examining the European hull design of the same era. Say 800 AD to 1300 AD, the contrast is not just about different materials, it's about fundamentally different functional priorities. For the European, the priority was cargo capacity, defense, and ease of access to short-haul continental trade. You stand in a medieval European shipyard. What you see are the ancestors of the great age of sail ships, the cog, the hulk, and the galley. The mainstream historical fact is that the common northern European trading ship of the High Middle Ages, the cog, was characterized by its clinker construction, overlapping planks, and its single square sail. This design was incredibly sturdy for the choppy North Sea and for riverine transport, but it was disastrously inefficient for high-speed long-distance voyaging. The cog was essentially a bathtub with a mast. It was designed to carry maximum freight between established ports like London and Bruges. Its wide, deep, rounded hull allowed for high capacity. But it severely limited its speed and maneuverability, especially when sailing against the wind. If the wind was blowing from the north and you wanted to go north, you were stuck. You would have to anchor or wait days for the wind to shift, consuming precious resources. This ship was a floating warehouse, not a nimble deep-sea explorer. Contrast this with the Lapita Voca. The Polynesian vessel was designed for speed, stability, and upwind performance. The Polynesian shipwrights optimized for the ratio of length to beam, making their hulls sleek. European shipwrights optimized for volume and defense, making their hulls short and boxy. This difference is key. The Polynesian mindset embraced the elements. The European mindset tried to resist them. The quirky tidbit here is the invention of the stern-post rudder. While the Chinese had been using stern-post rudders for centuries, Europeans only widely adopted them around the 12th and 13th centuries. Replacing the clumsy and difficult-to-manage side rudder or steering, this technological lag meant that earlier European ships were extremely difficult to steer in high seas, particularly large vessels like the cog. The introduction of the stern-post rudder was a massive breakthrough, but it came hundreds of years after the Polynesians had solved their own steering challenges using the simple but effective steering oar and the integrated steering board mentioned earlier. It's a perfect example of Europe playing catch-up in basic maneuvering technology. You, as a cog captain, might joke that the Polynesian canoe looks like a fishing basket tied to a log. You value the massive, intimidating freeboard of your ship, which offers protection from waves and rival arrows. But that height is also a liability in a sustained ocean storm, creating tremendous wind resistance and stress. You constantly fear the lee shore, where the wind blows you onto the coast, because your ship lacks the speed and upwind ability to claw its way out of danger. Your technology binds you to the coasts you are trying to hug. Historians still argue whether the most critical technological bottleneck for European deep-sea exploration was the rigging system, the reliance on square sails, or the method of hull construction, the clinker or carvel construction, which dictated size and strength. The truth is both limited them. The hull was heavy and deep-drafted, meaning it couldn't explore shallow island reefs, easily a necessity in the Pacific. The rigging forced dependence on favorable winds, making long, planned exploratory voyages a logistical nightmare. The most critical factor, however, was psychological and economic. The Mediterranean was too profitable and too familiar to risk venturing out into the ocean's uncertainty. Every small innovation in European naval design, the move from clinker to carvel planking in the 14th century, or the adoption of the lateen sail, was generally first applied to improving efficiency in existing trade routes, not enabling radical new exploration. They were optimizing the bathtub, not preparing for the ocean. Imagine again the Polynesian Voca Fast, light, easily repaired, and capable of landing on almost any shore. It was the perfect vehicle for colonization. The European cog was designed for trade and war on known contained waterways. It was built with the heavy hand of continental history, whereas the Voca was built with the elegant simplicity of pure aerodynamic and hydrodynamic efficiency. The technological divergence shows that the ocean demands a different kind of respect and engineering, one the Polynesians mastered through necessity and continuous trilander over millennia. While Europeans were content to let the Atlantic remain a terrifying, unprofitable mystery for centuries longer, their vessels simply reinforced their fear of the wide blue yonder. We now arrive at perhaps the most impressive and certainly the most mysterious aspect of Polynesian expansion. Wayfinding. This is where the gap between Polynesian mastery and European timidity becomes a chasm. European navigation, for centuries, was shackled to instruments and charts. Polynesian navigation was shackled to memory and the senses. Imagine yourself standing on the cross-platform of your vaca after sailing for weeks. There is no compass, no sextant, no paper chart. Your life, and the life of your entire community below you, rests on your ability to read the ocean itself. You are a tahua, a master navigator, and your mind is the map. The mainstream historical fact is that Polynesian wayfinding relied on a sophisticated system of non-instrumental navigation that synthesized knowledge of the stars, ocean swells, and subtle biological indicators. The stars are your clock and your compass. You don't just know the North Star. You know dozens of zenith stars that pass directly overhead, which can tell you your latitude. As the canoe moves, you identify the points on the horizon where specific stars rise and set. You use a mental or physical reference line along the length of your canoe, constantly adjusting your heading to keep the appropriate star on the correct bearing. You have memorized the entire celestial sphere, essentially creating a 360-degree compass card in your brain, one that is constantly corrected for the time of year. But the real genius lies in reading the ocean swells. Unlike the choppy, localized waves caused by wind, which European sailors also noticed, the ground swell travels thousands of miles across the Pacific, carrying an uninterrupted memory of distant weather and distant land masses. Even when you are too far away to see an island, the massive ocean swell will subtly refract and bend around that landmass. Your body, lying on the deck, can feel the difference between the primary swell and the faint, reflected secondary swell. This secondary swell is a signpost telling you that land is over there, perhaps 300 or 400 miles away, long before you can see it. The quirky tidbit here is the use of midikukura, or stick charts. While not used during the voyage as a real-time navigational tool, these Micronesian tools, related to Polynesian wayfinding principles, were models made of sticks, with shells representing islands. They weren't geographical maps. They were wave diagrams. They encoded the complex patterns of wave refraction around islands used to teach apprentices how the swells behave. This demonstrates that their knowledge of ocean dynamics was so advanced they could model it physically. You are acutely aware of the smallest details. You know that certain seabirds only feed within a certain radius of land, and if you follow them in the evening, they will lead you home. You know that a shift in the color of the water from deep indigo to lighter blue might indicate a shallower reef or the plume of a distant volcanic island. You can even detect land by the smell of specific terrestrial plants carried on the wind salty. Vegetative scent, often described as the smell of land. Historians still argue whether the long-distance voyages were primarily based on wayfinding, the intentional, skilled search for land, or target finding, the precision navigation to a known location, often achieved through two-way voyages. The difference is subtle but important. Wayfinding implies exploration and the ability to find any land. Target finding implies the ability to reliably find a small, previously discovered island and return. The fact that they achieved both is a testament to the system's power. Imagine trying to explain this methodology to a European navigator using a compass. He'd scoff. His system depends on instruments, man-made objects that can break, get wet, or be rendered useless by magnetic variation. Your system depends on your body, your memory, and the constant, reliable laws of physics, wind, and current. You probably wouldn't survive this journey if you had to rely on a flimsy, fogged-up brass compass. The Polynesian method integrated the ship and the sailor into the ocean ecosystem. It required total immersion and lifelong training, making the navigator a revered, almost magical figure in society. This cultural investment in human skill, rather than instrumental technology, gave them a freedom their European counterparts could only dream of. The Europeans were still fumbling with quadrants and calculating their latitude based on the sun's maximum height. A complex, error-prone process. The Polynesians were simply feeling their way across the largest ocean on Earth. This internal GPS, this profound connection to the natural world, is what allowed them to treat the ocean as a path, while the Europeans, lacking such skill, had to treat it as a terrifying, uncharted obstacle. Now let's cross back to the European side and dissect their reliance on instruments. While the Polynesian navigators were using ground swells as their primary guide, the European sailor was relying heavily on two crucial, yet limiting technologies, the compass and the celestial quadrant. This reliance on instruments, or what we can call the European navigation toolkit, fundamentally constrained their ability to explore. You are on a small 13th century European ship, perhaps a Norman hulk sailing from Portugal toward Ireland. Your most prized possession is the magnetic compass. The mainstream historical fact is that the compass, borrowed from the East and refined in the Mediterranean, was vital for maintaining a course when the stars or sun were obscured. Before the compass, European sailors relied purely on celestial observation, if they could see the stars, or highly inaccurate dead reckoning if they couldn't. The compass offered stability and directionality, freeing them from constant dependence on the shore. However, the compass had a massive inherent flaw that limited to ocean journeys: magnetic declination. The compass needle points, north magnetic northwich, is not the same as true north, and the difference changes depending on where you are on the globe. Early European sailors were completely unaware of this phenomenon and its variability. They assumed the compass was pointing precisely to the geographic North Pole when they began venturing out into the Atlantic. The discrepancies between their compass reading and their true course became alarming and inexplicable. Fueling superstitions about the Sea of Darkness, they didn't know the instrument itself was lying to them. You probably would unsurvive this if you sailed off the coast of Lisbon for a week, only to realize your instrument was systematically misleading you. To calculate their latitude, they relied on the quadrant, or the later improved astrolabe. You, the navigator, would use this brass instrument to measure the height of the North Star above the horizon, or the maximum height of the sun at midday. This allowed you to determine your latitude, your north-south position, which was crucial. But here is the crucial drawback. These calculations require a fixed reference point, the horizon, and stable conditions. Trying to sight the sun or a star from the rolling, open deck of a small cog in a rough Atlantic swell led to enormous errors. Furthermore, the European system of navigation was excellent for finding latitude, but notoriously poor at finding longitude, your east-west position. Accurate longitude measurement required knowing the precise time difference between your current location and a known starting point, a problem that was unreliably solved until the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th centuries after the Polynesian zenith. The quirky tidbit that emphasizes this reliance on the physical chart is the development of the Portolan charts. These were highly accurate, beautiful maps of the Mediterranean coastlines, characterized by a complex network of rhumb lines, straight lines, radiating from a central point used for plotting courses between ports. They were masterpieces of local cartography, but they focused almost entirely on coastal features, not on the open ocean. When Europeans did venture into the Atlantic, they quickly ran out of coastline to draw, and the Portolan charts became useless, reinforcing their fear of the uncharted void. Historians still argue whether the absence of a reliable instrument for measuring longitude was the single greatest scientific barrier preventing Europe from mastering the deep oceans, or if the lack of appropriate hull design and societal incentive was more significant. All three factors were bottlenecks, but the inability to reliably fix your position in the vast Atlantic meant that every long voyage was a gamble on finding the return route. The key difference lies in the information medium. The European system transferred knowledge onto physical artifacts, charts, instruments, written rudders. If those artifacts were lost, damaged, or flawed, like a compass with uncorrected declination, the knowledge was gone. The Polynesian system, as we discussed with wayfinding, internalized the knowledge. The navigator was the instrument, the memory, and the map. His knowledge of the natural world, the swell patterns, the clouds, the animals could not be lost to a rogue wave or a leaky scroll. You, the European sailor, are looking down at your instruments, constantly seeking validation from brass and paper. You are anxious, confined by your reliance on technology that is only partially suited for the ocean. The Polynesians looked up at the stars and down into the water, constantly seeking validation from the natural world itself. Their cultural investment was in the human brain. Europe's was in the bronze tool. This contrast is fundamental to understanding why one culture spanned an ocean, while the other stayed within sight of the shore. As we explore the technological edge of the Polynesian voyagers, we move beyond the boat itself and look at what made colonization possible, provisioning the voyage. A vessel can only take you to a new land. What you bring with you determines whether you establish a temporary camp or a permanent, thriving society. The Polynesians mastered the art of creating a portable ecosystem. You are helping load the vaca for a long journey from Ryutser, bound for a distant, rumored island. This is not a simple supply run. It's the packing list for a new world. The mainstream historical fact is the concept of canoe crops. These vital, easily propagated staple plants grow yams, breadfruit, coconut, and a highly useful paper mulberry for cloth were carried as live cuttings or tubers, ready to be planted immediately upon arrival. This contrasts sharply with the European approach, which often relied on dry grains or preserved meats, which are not suitable for starting an agricultural colony on a distant shore. The Polynesians brought the entire foundation of their agricultural system with them. They knew that relying on fishing alone was unsustainable for a new population. They needed starch, and they needed it fast. The success of the colonization was not measured by gold or silk, but by the successful establishment of a taro patch. Their goal was biological replication of their existing society. And then there are the animals. Remember the pigs, chickens, and dogs. They weren't just food, they were genetic stock. These animals, carefully selected and transported, formed the protein base for the new colony. Transporting a live pig or a chicken across thousands of miles of ocean is a logistical feat in itself, requiring dedicated space, fresh water, and feed for the duration. The Polynesians recognized the long-term value of maintaining these gene pools, ensuring that the new island could sustain their traditional diet and culture. You might joke about the smell of the canoe after a month at sea, crammed with root vegetables, small children, and restless pigs, but this careful, comprehensive provisioning is the secret to their success. They sailed with the absolute confidence that they were bringing everything required to survive, not just the people. The quirky tidbit relates to water storage. Given the enormous size of the Pacific and the duration of the voyages, fresh water was the most critical resource. Polynesians developed sophisticated methods, often using large sealed sections of bamboo or sometimes even hollowed-out gourds and coconut shells to maximize water storage efficiency. However, a crucial part of their strategy was rainfall collection. They designed their large sails and the cross-platform roof to funnel rainwater directly into their storage containers during squalls. They treated rain not as a nuisance, but as a vital opportunity, showing a deep integration of their ship design with their survival needs. Historians still argue whether the most challenging element of the portable ecosystem was managing the biosecurity preventing pests, diseases, and cross-contamination during the voyage. Simply the weight and space constraint required to carry enough viable food stock for months. The margin for error was razor-thin. If their cuttings or tubers spoiled, the entire colonizing effort would fail upon landing. Compare this once again to the European scenario. The early European coastal traders were provisioned with hardtack biscuits, dried meat, and barrels of wine or weak beer rations designed for short-known voyages. When they did try longer trips like the Vikings, they often relied on opportunistic hunting or fishing and failed to establish a sustainable agricultural base in harsher climates. The most famous example of European long-distance provisioning failure is the scurvy epidemic, which plagued global voyages for centuries, indicating a fundamental lack of understanding of long-term nutritional needs. You probably wouldn't survive this trip if your only food was a dusty biscuit and contaminated water. Yet the European ships sailed that way for hundreds of years. The Polynesian voyager, on the other hand, was provisioned not just for the journey, but for the day after arrival. The minute the canoe touched the sand, the work of planting began. This integrated approach boat, navigator, and food supply forming a single self-contained system allowed them to jump from archipelago to archipelago, leapfrogging the vast oceanic distances, turning the empty Pacific into a populated realm. Their colonization was fundamentally biological and agricultural, a complete societal restart package that had been refined through thousands of years of island hopping. The stark contrast between the Polynesian self-sufficiency and the European approach becomes even clearer when we look at European supply chains. If the Polynesians excelled at bringing their entire world with them, the Europeans were masters of coastal logistical limits. Their maritime endeavors were entirely dependent on proximity and known networks. Imagine yourself on a European trading galley or cog in the 12th century. The goal of your voyage is fundamentally different from that of the Polynesian. You are not searching for an empty, unpopulated island to colonize. You are sailing to a known, established Port Genoa, Marseille, Tunis, or London. The mainstream historical fact is that early European long-distance shipping capacity was dedicated primarily to bulk cargo wine, timber, wool, and later, spices, nuts, long-term survival provisions for the crew. The ships were designed to carry trade, not colonists. If you needed food, you expected to buy it at the next port. If you needed water, you refilled your barrels at the next coastal city with a reliable well. This reliance on known ports and short resupply intervals meant that European vessels lacked the capacity and the culture to embark on voyages of true isolation. They couldn't survive being disconnected from the land-based civilization for long stretches. This created a severe psychological and practical barrier. To hug the coast was to guarantee survival and the ability to repair, resupply, and report. To venture into the deep Atlantic meant cutting the logistical umbilical cord. If a storm drove you off course and you missed your intended resupply point, you faced certain starvation and thirst. You probably wouldn't survive this trip if you relied on the supply chain of a European vessel. The quirky tidbit here relates to the concept of ship time versus shore time. For the European sailor, time at sea was inherently risky and unproductive. It was the interval between lucrative ports. They sought to minimize ship time and maximize shore time. Their provisions, dry, preserved, and often lacking in fresh nutrients, reflected this short-term view. The Polynesian voyager, conversely, had to treat the ship as the only stable environment, the home itself, making the ship time the core of the experience, and provisioning was geared toward maximizing the viability of that floating home. Historians still argue whether the biggest logistical impediment was the preservation of food, the inability to keep meat or fresh vegetables from spoiling, or the sheer volume of water required for months at sea. Even with wine or beer replacing water, a common, if nutritionally questionable, practice, the weight and space taken up by liquids alone drastically limited the amount of cargo or people a European vessel could carry for true long-term travel. Remember how the Polynesians carried livestock and live cuttings? European ships, especially the earlier ones, rarely carried live animals beyond a few chickens or goats, which were usually for the officer's table, not for breeding a new colony. The concept of carrying a portable ecosystem was alien. They carried dry seeds or grains, but the sophisticated knowledge of how to cultivate tropical staples in a new island environment was absent. Their knowledge base was continental, focused on wheat, barley, and vines. This deep reliance on coastal logistics is what kept the Europeans from moving beyond near Europe for so long. They were constrained by their own history rooted in the Mediterranean and the trade routes of the Roman Empire, which were never more than a few days' sail from a known port. When they finally started their age of exploration in the 15th century, the key breakthrough was not just the caravel ship, but the establishment of fortified coastal trading posts like those the Portuguese set up in West Africa. These posts were intended to recreate the Mediterranean's short logistical loop on a global scale. The European model was always about extending the supply chain, never about achieving true depotion independence. The Polynesian traveler, on the other hand, was an island in himself. His vessel was a complete, contained universe. His goal was not to find a port of call, but to create one. This self-reliance made them flexible and fearless. You are standing on your European deck, looking toward the open Atlantic, and you know that if you sail too far, you are throwing yourself at the mercy of chance, without the navigational skill or the self-contained provisions to guarantee your return, let alone a successful landing on the other side. This logistical gap is precisely why the European world hugged the coastline. Until economic desperation and technological breakthroughs finally made the depotion leap a viable, profitable risk. Beyond the technical marvels of the vaca and the provisioning skills, the Polynesian expansion was driven by a powerful cultural engine, the concept of Hawaii. This is where belief, history, and pure motivation intersect to drive humanity across the horizon. Hawaii is not just a place, it's a living, breathing mythos as a motivational map. You are sitting in a meeting house in Rarotonga, listening to the elders chant. You hear the story of the origin place, the land of the ancestors, the place where the spirits return. The mainstream historical fact is that Hawaii serves as the ancestral homeland in the oral traditions of many Polynesian groups, including Ambori, Hawaiian, and Tahitian. While its exact geographic location is debated by modern historians, its symbolic power was universal. It was the source, the home base from which all journeys originated. This belief system provides the crucial psychological difference. The Polynesian sailor wasn't sailing into the unknown void. He was expanding his world outward from a known center. His voyage was not just an adventure or a trade route. It was an act of cultural continuity, a replication of the founding voyages of his ancestors. Every new island discovered was a new node on the massive, culturally sanctioned web that originated at Hawaii. This mythos did several things simultaneously. First, it gave legitimacy to the act of voyage. Chiefs who sponsored or led successful voyages gained immense status, linking their lineage directly to the ancient heroes who first left Hawaii. Second, and crucially, it provided a directional narrative. Even if they were sailing toward an island that had only been seen in a dream or described in a distant chant. The goal was framed as fulfilling an ancestral imperative, making the risk more acceptable. The quirkier tidbit is how Hawaii may relate to actual geography. Modern linguistic and genetic research strongly suggests that the ancestral Hawaii is likely located in the islands of Samoa and Tonga, or perhaps even further west, in Fiji, the region of Western Polynesia. This area was settled first and served as the cultural, linguistic, and genetic heartland from which the final extreme voyages to eastern Polynesia, Hawaii, New Zealand, Easter Islands sprang. Thus, the myth of Hawaii is not just a fanciful legend. It's a cultural memory of a real, earlier staging point, a geographical truth encoded into oral history. Imagine trying to convince a European peasant in the year 1100 to sail off the map by telling him a story about the mythical Atlantis. He would laugh and tell you he has a harvest to bring in. The Polynesian myth of Hawaii, however, was woven into the fabric of daily life, into the genealogies, the songs, and the political structure. It was a verifiable, actionable legend. Historians still argue whether the concept of Hawaii was more important as a unifying cultural identity, a shared origin story, or as a practical navigational cipher, a mnemonic device that held clues and directions to the various islands and star paths along the way. It likely acted as both, a way to unite disparate islands under a common ancestor, while simultaneously encoding highly useful, practical knowledge into a format easily remembered and passed down. Contrast this with the European narrative. The European explorer, when he finally sailed off the map, was driven by much more prosaic motives: profit gold, spices, politics, new territory for the crown, and proselytization, spreading Christianity. These were external, practical motivators. There was no deep, millennial cultural imperative urging them to colonize a vast, empty ocean simply to replicate their ancestral journey. Their great mythical oceans were sources of fear, not a path to ancestral glory. When you, the Polynesian, board the Vaka, you are not just a sailor. You are a continuation of the Hawaii lineage. You are not sailing for a king's distant glory. You are sailing for the perpetuity of your people. This cultural underpinning transformed colonization from a high-risk venture into a sacred duty. This profound difference in mindset mythos, as a magnetic pull-in, enabled the Polynesians to attempt and succeed at voyages that Europeans, bound by practical concerns and lacking such a powerful, unifying narrative, would avoid for centuries nervously, staring out at the sea of darkness. Following the powerful pull of the Hawaii mythos, we must now consider the counterpoint, the motivations, or lack thereof, that shaped the early European maritime world. It was dominated by European land hunger, an intense focus on continental conquest, feudal loyalty, and the immediate profits of overland trade. You are a landed noble or a wealthy merchant in Flanders or Tuscany around the 11th century. What occupies your mind? Not oceanic exploration, but land, labor, and control. The mainstream historical fact is that the European social and economic structure during the Middle Ages was overwhelmingly agrarian and continental. Wealth, power, and status were measured by the amount of land you owned and the number of people who worked that land. The sea was primarily a means of moving goods between existing known centers of power. There was simply no socioeconomic mechanism in place to incentivize high-risk, depotion colonization. Why would a powerful lord spend vast sums building a ship to sail for 6 months to a hypothetical small, empty island when he could use that money to purchase a neighboring fiefdom, acquire more serfs, or build a stronger castle? The return on investment for continental conquest was immediate, predictable, and measurable in tons of wheat and numbers of soldiers. The return on investment for oceanic exploration was theoretical, distant, and often mythical. This mindset fostered a culture of lore-esque trade within established routes. The great mercantile houses of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa were focused on the short, reliable journey to the Levant for spices and silks. They optimized their entire infrastructure, insurance, banking, and shipping around this low-risk, high-volume flow of goods. Sailing beyond the known trade lanes was seen not as enterprising, but as reckless. The quirky tidbit here relates to the concept of feudal obligations. You, as a peasant, or even a minor noble, were legally bound to your land or your lord. You could not simply decide to pack up your family and sail away. To leave your land was often an act of social and legal transgression, punishable by law. This systemic lockdown of the population contrasted sharply with the Polynesian system, where competition for resources and political status often required ambitious individuals and their followers to launch voyages to gain new territories and escape political constraints. The Polynesian system encouraged mobility. The European system demanded stasis. Historians still argue whether the greatest inhibitor was the lack of capital accumulation necessary to finance massive exploratory voyages, or the distraction of internal European conflicts like the Crusades and incessant interkingdom wars, which drained resources and attention away from external exploration. Regardless of the exact balance, the focus was overwhelmingly inward and continental. When Europe finally did push out centuries later, the motivation was less about finding empty land, as the Polynesians did, and more about finding a route to Asia that bypassed the Ottoman-controlled overland spice trade. Even the famous voyages of Columbus and da Gama were fundamentally about trade routes and access to established Eastern wealth, not about colonization for its own sake on remote islands. They were looking for an economic detour, not a new world to populate. Imagine again the Polynesian on the Vaca, driven by a mythos and a need for new space to plant his taro and raise his children. His goal is cultural survival and expansion. Now picture the European sailor in the 13th century. His motivation is to safely deliver a cargo of wool to the next familiar port and receive his pay. The scope, the ambition, and the accepted risk level of these two lives are astronomically different. The early European attempts at island colonization, such as the Norse settlements in Greenland, were often unsustainable because they lacked the complete self-sustaining portable ecosystem and the deep navigational commitment of the Polynesians. When the climate turned cold or the supply chain from Europe broke, those settlements failed. They were isolated European outposts, not true, biologically independent colonies. This persistent land hunger and continental focus is what fundamentally separated the two cultures. The European world was too busy fighting over existing dirt to embrace the empty, terrifying blue. The Polynesians understood that the ocean was simply a vast, watery pasture separating fertile new lands. Their culture was geared toward utilizing the space between the islands. The European culture was entirely obsessed with optimizing the space on the continents. This is why the European coast huggers stayed home while the Polynesian sprawl covered half the globe. As we consider the sheer difference in motivation, we must pivot to the execution, colonization strategy. The contrast between Polynesian and early European expansion is the difference between a meticulously planned arrival and an often accidental landing. You are preparing for a voyage from Tahiti to Hawaii sometime around 1000 AD. This is not a casual trip. It is an orchestrated, state-level endeavor. The mainstream historical fact is that Polynesian colonization voyages were deliberate. Two-way missions carrying a complete social and biological profile, including both sexes, multiple families, and the essential canoe crops. This ensured the immediate genetic and agricultural viability of the new settlement. The goal was always replication. The moment you reached your destination, you knew exactly what to do: clear the land, build rudimentary shelters, and immediately plant the taro and yam cuttings you'd carefully preserved during the journey. The first priority was to transition from reliance on stored provisions back to a stable, land-based food economy. The success of the colony was judged by its ability to become self-sufficient within the first year, completely decoupled from the need for resupply from the home island. The meticulous nature of this planning is what sets it apart. The chiefs and navigators weren't just searching for land, they were searching for habitable land on island with sufficient fresh water, fertile soil, and the right climatic conditions to support the imported ecosystem. If an island was found but deemed unsuitable for the canoe crops, it was often bypassed or abandoned, as survival was paramount. Now consider the early European efforts. Take the Viking voyages to North America, or even the establishment of trading posts in North Africa during the early medieval period. These were often opportunistic, driven by resource extraction, timber, furs, or trade. The colonists who came were usually military men or traders, overwhelmingly male, and often lacking the comprehensive agricultural knowledge necessary for long-term self-sufficient survival in a totally new, harsh environment. The quirky tidbit here is the concept of the tillerman, or chief navigator, being responsible for selecting the future location of the settlement while still at sea. This person had to mentally evaluate not just the destination, but the entire environmental profile of the journey, ensuring the community had the right mix of skills and materials to survive the first brutal year. This strategic planning extended to the demographics of the voyagers. They often ensured a balanced gene pool and a mix of craftsmen and farmers, a far cry from the often single skill composition of early European exploration parties. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for the planned colonization voyages was push factors, overpopulation, and conflict on the originating islands, or pull factors, the intentional search for status and wealth in new territories. Regardless, the execution remained planned and holistic. It wasn't a panicked escape. It was an organized resettlement. You probably wouldn't survive this on a European vessel. If you were a Spanish sailor accidentally blown across the Atlantic in the 14th century and landed on the shores of a new continent, you would be utterly unprepared. You'd have no idea how to cultivate the local staples. You wouldn't have the genetic stock for your traditional food, and you'd be totally reliant on either immediate resource extraction or a rescue ship that might never come. Your survival would be an accident of fate. The Polynesian strategy, by contrast, treated the arrival as simply the beginning of the next phase of life. It was integrated into the voyage itself. They had done the calculations. They knew the minimum viable population size, the time to harvest for their crops, and the essential tools required. This level of forethought, the comprehensive planning of a societal reboot, made their colonization efforts uniquely successful and permanent across the Pacific. In essence, the European explorer often landed by accident and then decided what to do. The Polynesian colonist landed by design and immediately executed the pre-agreed plan. One was an improvisation, the other a symphony. This difference in strategy is foundational, leading directly to the next point, the storage of the knowledge that made the planning possible. The genius of Polynesian colonization lay not just in the planning, but in how the crucial information navigational data, planting schedules, and landing protocols was stored and transmitted. This brings us to the missing rudder. Oral tradition as chart. While Europeans relied on parchment and ink, the Polynesians relied on memory and performance. You are an apprentice navigator, and you are learning not from a book, but from the master's mouth as you sail. The mainstream historical fact is that detailed navigational knowledge, including star paths, sailing directions like a rudder, and the location of islands, was preserved in Polynesian societies through sophisticated systems of oral recitation, chants, and genealogies. Kuawau. This oral system was far more reliable and detailed than a modern observer might assume. It wasn't simply a casual telling of tales. It was a highly formalized, ritualized transfer of information, often involving mnemonic devices, rhythmic repetition, and intense, dedicated training. The entire route from, say, Waihai, back to Tahiti, a trip covering thousands of miles, could be encoded into a single complex chant, with each verse describing a star bearing, a current change, or a sign of land. The knowledge was sacred, highly controlled, and passed down within specific lineages of expert navigators. This protected the information from casual loss and ensured its accuracy through constant verification during real voyages. The information was a living map, constantly being updated with the experiences of the latest generation of voyagers. Now, think about the European equivalent, the rudder or roteiro in Portuguese. The rudder was the European attempt to codify sailing directions descriptions of coastal features, harbors, hazards, and bearings written down on paper or vellum. While rudders were essential for European coastal trade, they were static and vulnerable. If a rudder was lost, burned, or transcribed incorrectly, the knowledge was gone. Furthermore, early rudders were largely useless for the deep ocean, as they relied entirely on visible landmarks that simply don't exist in the middle of the Atlantic. The quirky tidbit that illustrates the depth of the oral tradition is the inclusion of weather forecasts and seasonal changes within the chants. A master navigator's genealogy might not only list his ancestors, but also list the appropriate months marked by the rising of specific constellations, such as the Pleiades, for launching an exploratory voyage when the winds are most favorable and the provisioning is ripe. This holistic knowledge system encompassed cosmology, meteorology, history, and survival, all in one rhythmic performance. Historians still argue whether the flexibility of the oral tradition allowed for better adaptation to changing environmental conditions like shifting currents or climate change, or if the fixity of the written European rudder ultimately proved more efficient for large-scale mercantile expansion. The Polynesian system was decentralized but highly redundant. Many navigators knew the same core knowledge. The European system was centralized in charts and books but highly fragile if the physical documents were lost. You, as a European sailor, are constantly checking your written text. You are trusting a piece of paper that might be wrong, faded, or ruined by saltwater. If your rudder says 3 days north of the Green Coast and the coast is obscured by fog, you are lost. You rely on external memory aids. The Polynesian, having internalized the memory, is simply looking at the signs that the knowledge describes. He doesn't just read about the swell, he feels the swell, a technique far more reliable than a water-stained page. This investment in the oral tradition speaks volumes about the Polynesian cultural values. They prioritized the human mind as the ultimate storehouse of knowledge, ensuring that the critical ability to navigate and colonize was passed down with the same rigor and respect as the lineage of the chiefs themselves. This profound commitment to the navigator's memory meant that their entire maritime history, the location of thousands of islands, and the pathways between them, was constantly traveling with them, instantly accessible, and perfectly suited for the depotion. Isolation where charts are useless and instruments break. The ability to carry the map in your head is what truly defined their mastery of the Pacific. Having delved into the cultural map of oral tradition, let's explore the physical engine that powered the Polynesian expansion: climate and currents. The Pacific is not a random expanse of water, it's a massive, predictable machine, and the Polynesians knew exactly how to harness its power. The ocean itself provided both the map and the motor. You are sailing in the South Pacific, and you feel the steady push of the trade winds. The mainstream historical fact is that the vast interland distances of the Pacific are traversed by highly reliable, consistent wind patterns, the northeast and southeast trade winds, which blow toward the equator and were crucial for planned downwind voyages. Crucially, the Polynesians understood how the entire system shifts seasonally. They timed their most ambitious voyages, such as the one from the Society Islands to Hawaii to coincide with the annual periods when these reliable trade winds either reverse or become less dominant, allowing them to sail upwind into the prevailing currents for the journey north, and then ride the powerful, reliable downwind currents for the return journey home. This seasonal understanding was encoded in their navigation chants. As we discussed, they didn't fight the ocean. They waited for the ocean to offer the perfect sailing window, coupled with the winds or the ocean currents. Within the Pacific, massive equatorial current systems flow west, which is excellent for the initial phases of the Austronesian expansion moving eastward. Against the current required skill, but settling westward was easy. But they also learned to use the vast, slower, looping current systems that characterize the deep ocean. These currents, such as the North Pacific Gyre, allowed for a slower but powerful drift. The key was knowing where the currents would take you, allowing for what is sometimes called drift voyaging with intention. The quirky tidbit here is the phenomenon of El Niño and La Niña. Polynesians were aware that large cyclical weather changes caused by the El Niño southern oscillation, and so could temporarily reverse wind patterns and alter sea levels. They likely used this knowledge to their advantage. For instance, an ambitious chief might launch an exploratory voyage during an El Niño year, knowing that the normally dominant trade winds might weaken or shift, opening up a temporary sailing corridor that would otherwise be closed. Their success was built on an active, sophisticated use of climate cycles, not just basic wind direction. Historians still argue whether the colonization of eastern Polynesia, the most remote islands, was primarily enabled by the development of highly efficient crab claw sails, allowing them to beat upwind, or by the strategic exploitation of seasonal wind shifts related to the ITCZ and ENSO. It is likely a combination of both. Technological means, combined with meteorological intelligence, allowed them to solve the problem of sailing into the largest part of the ocean. You probably wouldn't survive this trip if you were a European sailor using your square-rigged cog. The square sail is terrible for upwind travel, meaning you would be permanently constrained by the trade winds, only able to sail with the current, which severely limits your options for planned round-trip voyages to specific, distant locations. Your European worldview simply didn't require or achieve this level of meteorological mastery. The Polynesian voyager, on the other hand, viewed the Pacific as a complex, three-dimensional roadmap. The winds were the accelerator, the currents were the guardrails, and the stars were the signposts. This intimate knowledge meant that they could confidently launch voyages into areas that Europeans deemed insurmountable. Geographical barriers for centuries, they understood that the ocean was predictable if you knew its rhythms, and by learning those rhythms, they essentially turned the Pacific from a terrifying void into a massive cooperative engine for their expansion. This contrasts sharply with the fearful, unpredictable environment of the Atlantic that their European counterparts faced, which we will look at next. As the Polynesian voyager sailed his predictable Pacific highway, the European coast hugger faced a terrifying temperamental monster, the unfamiliar Atlantic Fury. The simple geographical differences between the Mediterranean Pacific and the Atlantic played a huge role in the European stagnation. You stand on the deck of a 14th century merchant vessel, looking west from the coast of Brittany. The Atlantic is cold, deep, and unpredictable. The mainstream historical fact is that the Atlantic Ocean is fundamentally different from the Mediterranean and the Pacific in key areas. It is subject to more violent, fast-moving, and less predictable low-pressure systems, nor'easters, for instance, and its currents near the coast are immensely powerful and difficult to navigate. The sheer size was also a factor, but the lack of predictable, isolated islands made the Atlantic a geographical void. Unlike the Pacific, which is studied with high visibility, volcanic islands that serve as stepping stones, the mid-Atlantic offers almost no refuge until you hit the Sargasso Sea or the Azores, which were unknown or difficult to reach for centuries. The Polynesians had the advantage of an archipelago-rich environment. The Europeans faced a vast, empty stretch of water. The greatest fear for the European sailor was not merely getting lost, but the violent, destructive wave environment. The Atlantic's long fetch, the distance over which wind blows unimpeded, allows for the creation of massive, steep, and destructive waves far more perilous than the longer, gentler swells of the open Pacific. The high, square hulls of European cogs were uniquely vulnerable to these crashing waves, which could easily splinter their heavy timber planking. Remember how the Polynesian vaca used flexible lashings to breathe with the sea? The European ship used rigid timber and iron, a design that proved brittle against the Atlantic's brute force. The quirky tidbit here is the North Atlantic Gyre. This massive circulating current system includes the Gulf Stream, which brings warm water north. While modern mariners used this current to speed up eastbound voyages in the early medieval period, the unpredictable, massive movements of this warm current near the coast, coupled with the frequent fogs, it creates added layers of confusion to European navigation. They were unable to distinguish reliably between coastal currents and the deep-ocean gyres, which made predicting drift an impossibility, further reinforcing their fear and conservatism. Historians still argue whether the primary psychological inhibitor to European deep-ocean exploration was the unpredictable weather patterns of the Atlantic, the fury, or the lack of economic incentive to travel vast distances when the Mediterranean trade was so profitable. It is clear that the lack of predictable currents and winds, the very tools the Polynesians exploited, made the risk calculation. In the Atlantic, fundamentally different and far less favorable, you probably wouldn't survive this trip if you were relying on European navigational methods. If a massive Atlantic storm blew you 500 miles off course, you had no reliable way to correct your longitude, no island to aim for, and no internalized oral map to guide you back. You were alone with a faulty compass and a leaky hull. This contrasts sharply with the Polynesian voyager, who, even when blown off course, could read the water and the sky for familiar signs. The Atlantic was not only a physical barrier, but a profound psychological barrier. Medieval European maps often depicted the Atlantic's edges with dragons, monsters, and the edge of the world. This mythology was more than superstition. It was a cultural projection of the genuine terror and uncertainty that the deep ocean inspired. For the European, the ocean was the place where order dissolved into chaos. For the Polynesian, the ocean was the most ordered, predictable, and knowable part of their world. This foundational difference in perception explains why one culture embraced the deep, and the other hugged the familiar coastline for centuries. We have established the technical and geographical differences. Now let's focus on the deep human drivers, societal drivers, status, and resource pressure. Why did Polynesian society continually invest in such risky, massive endeavors? The motivation was both practical and deeply political. You are a young chief in a thriving but crowded island society like Mangaia or the Society Islands around 800 AD. The land is good, but the population is growing. The mainstream historical fact is that the pressure on finite resources, arable land, and seafood stocks on small, isolated islands was a continuous and powerful push factor for Polynesian voyages. Unlike continental Europe, where internal migration or continental conquest could alleviate pressure, the only solution for an island society facing overcrowding was to sail away. This pressure cooker environment created a cultural solution: institutionalized exploration. The voyage was a safety valve, allowing ambitious or disenfranchised junior chiefs, or segments of the population facing famine or defeat in local conflicts, to seek a fresh start. This movement wasn't necessarily a desperate flight. It was often an organized historic endeavor led by elite navigators. Crucially, successful discovery brought immense status to the chief who led the voyage. To find and successfully colonize a new, uninhabited island was the ultimate political and cultural achievement. It secured resources for his lineage for generations and cemented his place in the Ku'ahau, the sacred genealogical chants. This higherward status system strongly incentivized the perpetual search for new lands, even if they lay thousands of miles away. It was a cycle of prestige-driven expansion. The quirky tidbit here is the Polynesian practice of naming the ocean itself. In some traditions, specific areas of the deep ocean, particularly those around significant archipelagos, were named after historical voyagers or events. This institutionalized the geography of exploration into the public memory, turning the ocean from an abstract threat into a named navigable space, a place where history happened. This contrasts sharply with the fearful, often nameless void of the European Atlantic. Historians still argue whether famine and resource scarcity were the stronger motivators for the major colonization waves, or if interestland warfare and political rivalry, the chief seeking to escape or prove his superiority, were more decisive. Regardless of the exact mix, the societal structure channeled both pressures into the same ultimate solution: oceanic expansion. Imagine yourself as a European peasant facing famine in 14th century France. Your only option is to move to a slightly less crowded village or beg from a more benevolent lord. The thought of commandeering a vessel and sailing out across the Atlantic to find a new France would be absurdly impossible, both logistically and legally. Remember that feudal lockdown. Your society did not permit or technologically support such a radical solution to resource pressure. The Polynesian voyager, however, had the technological means, the vaka, and the cultural approval, the Hawaii mythos, and the status reward to transform resource scarcity into an opportunity for greatness. Their social structure and their naval technology were perfectly aligned. The ambitious chief could use the threat of resource pressure to rally followers, secure the best canoe builders, and launch a voyage that was designed to fail in Europe but built to succeed in the Pacific. This continuous need for new land, fueled by the prestige of discovery, created an unparalleled, multi-generational engine of exploration that kept pushing the boundaries of the known world until they had populated the final, most remote corners of the Pacific, from Hawaii in the north to Rapa Nui in the east and Aotearoa, New Zealand, in the south. They sailed because their society demanded it for survival and rewarded it with statusa, mandate their European counterparts simply did not share. While the Polynesian world was fueled by the powerful engine of status and resource pressure, the early European world was defined by societal inertia, church, crown, and risk. The structures of power actively discouraged the kind of radical, risk-taking exploration that the Polynesians perfected. You are a tradesman in 13th century Paris. your world is incredibly structured, fixed, and geographically small. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval Europe was dominated by two highly conservative forces, the feudal system and the Catholic Church. Both institutions prioritized stability, continuity, and control over innovation and geographic uncertainty. The Church, as the supreme moral and intellectual authority, often discouraged excessive curiosity that might contradict established scripture or cosmology. The mythical dangers of the Atlantic Sea monsters, the edge of the world, and places outside God's known creation were frequently reinforced by religious doctrine. To sail too far was not just a geographic risk, it was potentially a spiritual one. This is not to say that the Church was uniformly against all knowledge, but its pervasive influence meant that Poetic exploration, lacking clear spiritual or political goals, was often seen as unnecessary adventurism. The crown and the feudal system reinforced this. All wealth derived from the land. Taxation, military power, and lineage were tied to the physical geography of the continent. Kings and princes had little incentive to invest massive sums in ships that might sail away and never return, potentially establishing new loyalties or new economic centers outside the existing taxing authority. Capital, what little there was, flowed toward continental warfare. Infrastructure like roads and churches and local trade. The result was a culture where risk was generally discouraged. The Polynesian chief, who failed to find land, might be disgraced, but his society continued to support the concept of voyaging. The European merchant who lost his ship and cargo to the Atlantic was ruined, and his failure served as a powerful disincentive to anyone else considering a similar venture. The high cost of shipbuilding, coupled with rudimentary marine insurance, made ocean travel an economic gamble most preferred to avoid. The quirky tidbit here is the medieval belief in the antipodes. For centuries, scholars debated the existence of people living down under in the southern hemisphere, often concluding that it was impossible because they would fall off, or, if they existed, they couldn't possibly be related to Adam and Eve, which raised theological problems. This illustrates how abstract, non-geographic ideas, in this case, theological geometry, could act as a powerful brake on geographic exploration, reinforcing the idea that the world beyond the known Mediterranean was either dangerous, heretical, or simply empty. Historians still argue whether the lack of technological advancement, the slow adoption of the caravel, for instance, was a cause or a symptom of the European societal inertia. Was the technology lacking because they were technologically incapable, or because the conservative social structure stifled innovation and failed to provide the necessary economic demand for long-distance vessels? The latter seems more likely. The demand for short-haul trade dictated the shipbuilding, not the ambition of exploration. Imagine again the Polynesian chief launching a vaca packed with people, pigs, and cuttings, sailing into the sunrise for status and survival. Now imagine a European king being asked to fund a similar venture across the Atlantic. The king would demand a clear itinerary, a map which didn't exist, and a guaranteed return on investment, which was impossible. The financial outlay for a ship capable of surviving the Atlantic was enormous, and the risk was viewed as unacceptable by the very people who controlled the capital. The Polynesians had a built-in release valve for social and resource pressure. The Europeans did not. They were locked onto the continental landmass, their societies rigid, and their eyes turned inward. The sea was an extension of the land for trade or war, not an independent pathway to a new future. This deeply ingrained conservatism and the institutional discouragement of geographical risk are fundamental reasons why European sailors stayed so close to the familiar, while the Polynesians treated the entire ocean as their birthright. It is easy to focus on what the Polynesians had: the sophisticated canoes and wayfinding skills, and an equally important part of their success lies in what they lacked: metallurgy's absence. They achieved mastery of the ocean using only ingenuity applied to wood, fiber, and stone. You are watching a shipwright in ancient Rarotonga shaping a hull plank. He is not using an iron saw or steel chisel. He is using an adze made of highly polished basalt or jade. The mainstream historical fact is that Polynesian voyaging culture developed, flourished, and colonized the entire remote Pacific, entirely within a stone tool tradition. They had no knowledge of smelting or forging metal until European contact centuries later. This absence forced an extraordinary level of ingenuity in the use of natural materials. If you can't rely on iron nails to hold your boat together, you must find a more flexible and durable solution. Their solution, as we briefly noted before, was the use of Senate-cordage intricately woven coconut fiber for lashing. This method of construction, which we discussed as allowing the hull to breathe with the sea, turned a perceived disadvantage, no metal, into a profound structural advantage for deep ocean travel. Their boats were shock-absorbent in a way that rigidly nailed European hulls were not. Think about the repairability of the Vaca. If a lashing broke, it could be quickly replaced with spare fiber carried on the voyage. If a European ship's iron fastenings rusted or failed, repairs required sophisticated tools, a forge, and skilled blacksmith saw, things that are impossible to carry on a small, exploratory vessel for months at sea. The Polynesian vessel was self-repairing, using simple organic materials available everywhere they sailed. The quirkier tidbit is the use of shark skin as a rough form of sandpaper to smooth the wooden hull and reduce drag, crucial for speed and efficiency. They meticulously scraped the wood with shark skin, whose texture provided a natural abrasive. This detail illustrates the deep connection the culture had to the local marine environment, finding high-tech solutions in the biological resources around them. Every element of the ocean, from the stars to the sharks, was integrated into their survival toolkit. Historians still argue whether the necessity of operating without metal led to greater innovation, like the flexible lashing and superior hull shapes, or if the lack of metal eventually limited the scale of their vessels and the efficiency of their tools compared to later European ships. While metal certainly aided later European expansion, the Polynesians demonstrate that the correct engineering principles and material choices for the environment can trump advanced metallurgy. Imagine trying to explain to a European shipwright that your massive seaworthy boat is held together by string. He would scoff. The European tradition, already relying on iron for tools, weapons, and farming implements, naturally extended this reliance to shipbuilding. They saw iron nails as a sign of progress, a way to build bigger, stronger, and more permanent ships. But that strength came at the cost of flexibility and corrosion resistance in the harsh saltwater environment, a problem the Polynesians completely sidestepped through their mastery of organic materials. You probably wouldn't survive this trip if you had to worry about your hull literally tearing apart because of brittle, rusted iron fastenings. The Polynesian reliance on wood and fiber was not a sign of backwardness. It was a testament to appropriate technology. They had the perfect materials for the job at hand, sailing the vast, unpredictable, wave-swept Pacific. The absence of metallurgy forced them to be better engineers, resulting in vessels that were lighter, more durable, and more fundamentally adapted to the stresses of deep ocean voyaging than anything Europe produced for centuries. This ingenious constraint highlights how a lack of certain technology can sometimes spur a path to mastery that a heavier, more complex technology might inhibit. While the Polynesians were driven by necessity to engineer solutions using wood and fiber, the Europeans suffered from an innovation bottleneck, the age of sail delay. For centuries following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, naval design in Europe experienced a profound technological stagnation, delaying their oceanic expansion. You are examining the progress of European shipbuilding from the 5th century to the 13th century. What you find is a slow, incremental, and often localized evolution, not the radical, continuous innovation seen in the Lapita and Polynesian traditions. The mainstream historical fact is that the most critical breakthroughs in European deep-sea naval designs, specifically the development of the caravel and the adoption of the lateen-sailed, did not occur widely until the 14th and 15th centuries, long after the Polynesians had settled the remotest parts of the Pacific. Why the delay? The fall of Rome fragmented the European economy and centralized power. As we discussed, the focus shifted inward, and the immediate need was for simple, sturdy riverboats and coastal traders. There was no vast, centralized naval authority sponsoring deep ocean research. The existing Mediterranean galleys and northern European cogs were good enough for the existing economic environment. The square sail, inherited from antiquity, was highly inefficient for oceanic travel. It was easy to build and rig, but poor at sailing into the wind. The lateen triangular sail, which offered superior upwind performance, had been known in the Mediterranean since the early medieval period, primarily borrowed from Arab dhows, but its widespread adoption on large, sturdy European ships was slow and cautious. The caravel, a ship that finally combined a strong hull with the maneuverability of the lateen sail, was the breakthrough, but it took centuries to arrive, a clear sign of the bottleneck. The quirky tidbit here is the invention of tar and pitch production. While materials for sealing wooden hulls existed, the industrial-scale production of pine tar, essential for waterproofing and protecting European hulls and rigging, was a slow and often localized process. In contrast, the Polynesians had readily available organic sealants and resins from native trees like breadfruit sap that were naturally suited to their light construction methods. The European reliance on dense, water-absorbing timber and metal required this massive logistical support system of tar production, which was fragile and subject to interruptions. Historians still argue whether the most paralyzing effect of the bottleneck was the loss of classical knowledge from the Roman era, particularly in logistics and engineering, or the conservative guild system that controlled shipbuilding trades, making rapid, radical innovation difficult and risky. Shipwrights were bound by tradition and local requirements, and there was no mechanism to disseminate a better ship design across the continent quickly. Imagine yourself as a European shipbuilder showing off your latest cog in the 12th century. It's sturdy, heavy, and can carry a lot of wool. The idea of building a vessel that sacrifices some cargo volume for extreme speed and deep-ocean maneuverability, the Polynesian formula, would be dismissed as financially reckless and technologically unnecessary. You probably wouldn't survive this trip on a European vessel that lacks the lateen sail, which is the key to sailing against the prevailing wind. If you are caught in a bad weather pattern, you are doomed to drift because your sailing technology forces you to wait. The Polynesian system was optimized for active control over the voyage, the ability to choose a destination and reliably navigate to it, even against the wind. The European system was optimized for passive transport along established line sledding. The Polynesian mastery arose from a continuous practical application of trial and error in the ultimate proving ground, the open Pacific. The European delay stemmed from a lack of pressure and a fixation on existing profitable internal waterways. They didn't need a better ship until the economic landscape radically shifted, i.e., the closure of the spice routes. By the time Europe finally started building ships capable of world exploration, the caravels, the Polynesians had already finished their great expansion. The centuries of delay in Europe are a testament to how easily a civilization can remain blind to the potential of radical exploration when their existing systems are good enough. As the European world slowly crawled out of its naval bottleneck, the Polynesian world entered its final, most extreme phase of exploration. We now focus on the Marquesas mystery, the final colonization wave. This archipelago served as the crucial last staging ground for the final leap to the remotest corners of the Pacific. You are standing on the volcanic shores of the Marquesas Islands around 400 AD. These islands, situated in the vast, empty triangle of the Eastern Pacific, were themselves a tremendous achievement to reach, but they became the launchpad for even greater feats. The mainstream historical fact is that the Marquesas were the dispersal point for the settlement of Hawaii, Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, the three corners of the Polynesian Triangle, representing the limits of human oceanic expansion. Why the Marquesas? They are well placed geographically to access the deep-ocean currents and wind patterns that lead to these three distant, hard-to-find targets. They had fertile volcanic soil and the resources necessary to reprovision the massive vaca for the final, most extreme legs of the journey. The voyages from the Marquesas were not just long, they were incredibly difficult, because the target islands, especially Hawaii and Rapa Nui, are tiny specks separated by immense, truly void stretches of ocean. The voyage from the Marquesas to Hawaii, for example, required sailing north into the North Pacific Gyre and crossing the doldrums, the intertropical convergence zone, a zone of unpredictable, often windless weather. The voyage to Rapa Nui, conversely, was a relentless push into the southeast, against powerful prevailing winds and currents for much of the return trip. These were one-way non-stop trips that pushed the limits of the vaca's provisioning capacity. The quirky tidbit here is the Hakpa, or the fixed star. While many stars were used for latitude, the North Star, which is not highly visible or useful in the South Pacific, became an essential guide for the final voyage north to Hawaii. The navigators who settled Hawaii were skilled enough to know how to sail toward a region where the North Star would become visible and useful. essentially using a celestial reference point that their southern ancestors barely noticed. This demonstrates a continuous, adaptable evolution of their wayfinding technology, constantly incorporating new knowledge. Historians still argue whether the extreme isolation of these final voyages led to a rapid divergence of culture and language on the final destination islands, or if the strong unifying tradition of the Hawaii mythos maintained a remarkable degree of cultural similarity across the Polynesian Triangle despite the distances. The fact is, the cultural package they carried survived, but adapted dramatically to the unique environments of a tropical volcanic archipelago, Hawaii. A cold, mountainous landmass, Aotearoa, and a treeless, isolated island, Rapa Nui. Imagine trying to launch a European ship from the coast of Norway, at the same time trying to find a remote, unknown island that is thousands of miles away, with no resupply points, no reliable longitude, and a ship poorly suited for the sustained journey. You probably wouldn't survive this trip. The Polynesian navigators, however, had the confidence born of thousands of years of successful island hopping. They were not just explorers. They were genetic pioneers betting their entire lineage on the successful landing and colonization of a world they had only heard about. The Marquesas are the pivot point, the final moment where the centuries of Austronesian expansion culminated in the grandest act of deliberate human migration on Earth. Every piece of knowledge, every canoe crop, every star path memorized, and every lash of Senate cordage was tested on these final epic voyages. The Polynesians were not lucky. They were the product of millennia of refined, perfected oceanic science, and the Marquesas was their launching pad into the unknown. This profound confidence in their abilities is what allowed them to tackle the final challenge of the sea, its temper. The final voyages from the Marquesas, and indeed all successful Polynesian journeys, required an extraordinary level of practical mastery. This brings us to a deep appreciation of Polynesian seamanship, handling the heavy weather. Their ships were elegant, but their skills were robust, allowing them to navigate conditions that would send early European ships to the bottom. You are clinging to the cross-platform of your vaka as a fierce, sudden squall hits a common occurrence near the intertropical convergence zone. The canoe is taking on water, and the wind is trying to rip the sail from the mast. The mainstream historical fact is that Polynesian navigators and crews were masters of heavy weather sailing and rapid response. Their boats, though undicked, lacking a continuous waterproof covering over the hulls, were designed to survive swamping and self-bail quickly. The key to their heavy weather survival was stability and flexibility. Remember the Senate lashings. That flexibility prevents the hull from rigidly fighting the wave force. When a rogue wave crashes over the cross-platform, the crew's rapid, coordinated action is essential. They knew precisely how to rerig a shredded sail, rapidly jettison non-essential items to lighten the load, and, most importantly, scull or bail the water out of the hulls using specialized scoops. Their seamanship extended to the critical ability of heaving tow. This is the technique of positioning the vessel so that it lies relatively still in heavy seas, minimizing forward drift while maximizing stability, often done by trimming the sails and using the steering or a European square-decked cog with its heavy mast and high profile would often lose control in these conditions, resulting in the dreaded broaching turning sideways to the waves, leading to certain capsizing. The Vaka's lower profile and superior rigging allowed for more precise control in an emergency. The quirky tidbit here is the use of sea anchors or in the absolute worst storms, where the risk of being thrown onto a reef or capsizing was too great. Polynesian navigators would sometimes deploy a droga large basket, mat, or woven device lowered into the water off the bow. This drag device helped stabilize the boat, prevent it from running too fast, and keep the bow pointed into the waves, dramatically improving survivability. This is sophisticated, practical engineering applied to survival. Historians still argue whether the loss of some voyaging knowledge and large vaka designs in later Polynesian societies, like New Zealand's Mbori, who transitioned to less expansive coastal travel, was due to environmental factors, lack of giant timber on some islands, or the lack of continuous need once all islands were settled and the need for new discovery ended. Regardless, the peak skills required continuous practice. Imagine yourself as a European sailor witnessing this. Your experience of bad weather is one of fear clinging to the rigging, hoping the hull doesn't spring a leak, praying for the storm to end. The Polynesian experience is one of active management. You know you are in danger, but you have a practiced, multi-step plan for survival, and your boat is designed to cooperate with your efforts. You probably wouldn't survive this on a rigid European hull, where the structural integrity is constantly under threat. The deep practical skills of Polynesian seamanship, their ability to read the ocean in a storm, their speed in emergency repairs, and their knowledge of how to position their vessel against massive confused swells are a direct result of their cultural commitment to the sea. They were not just good sailors, they were ocean engineers who viewed heavy weather as a test, not an insurmountable disaster. This mastery of the practical mechanics of survival in the absolute worst conditions is the final proof that they were technologically and culturally centuries ahead of their European counterparts in true oceanic capability. The ultimate factor separating the two cultures was not merely technological or geographical, but deeply psychological. Psychological barrier. The fear of the unknown. The Polynesian viewed the ocean as a path, while the European medieval mind viewed the Atlantic as a boundary, a place of profound dread. You are standing on the European edge of the Atlantic in the 13th century. Your mind is filled with the stories of cartographers and priests. The mainstream historical fact is that the medieval European perspective largely embraced the classical and early Christian view of the Atlantic as the Oceanus Tenebrosus Sea of Darkness, a boundary filled with real and mythical dangers. Giant squids, consuming whirlpools, and even the edge of the flat Earth. This fear was reinforced by the very real inability of their ships to navigate its depths reliably. This wasn't just superstition, it was a societal agreement. The ocean was not an environment to be mastered. It was a terrifying realm to be avoided. The few who dared to venture far west, like the legendary voyages of St. Brendan, returned with stories that only reinforced the mythology and the impossibility of sustained deep travel. This collective cultural terror acted as a psychological anchor, keeping European ambition firmly tethered to the continental shelf. Now, shift your mindset to the Polynesian perspective. You are on the Vaca, staring at the same endless horizon. For you, the ocean is not a barrier. It is Te Moanan Wakiva, or the great ocean of Kiva, named revered and navigable space. Every element of the Setha stars, the currents, the waves is considered a signpost, a piece of information, not a threat. Their myths encouraged voyaging, celebrating heroes who successfully traversed the vastness, turning the ocean itself into a cultural stage for greatness. The quirky tidbit here is the naming of specific winds and currents. The Polynesian languages have an incredibly rich vocabulary for specific meteorological and hydrological phenomena, allowing for precise clinical discussion of conditions that the European sailor would simply group under the generic, fearful term, bad weather. This linguistic precision demystified the ocean. When you can name, categorize, and predict a phenomenon, it ceases to be a monster and becomes a manageable variable in your navigation equation. Historians still argue whether the Polynesian psychological fearlessness was a precondition. Did they start out less afraid? Or an acquired trait, did their continuous technological success reduce fear over time? It is likely the latter. Their success in building the right boats and developing the right skills transformed the perception of risk, turning the daunting unknown into a challenging but achievable objective. You probably wouldn't survive this trip if your mind was filled with European medieval dread. If your fear dictated your decisions, like turning back at the first sign of a strong swell, or losing heart when land failed to appear after 2 weeks, you would fail. The Polynesian voyager had to maintain an absolute, almost ritualistic calm, viewing setbacks as natural parts of the journey, not omens of impending doom. The Polynesian voyager, in essence, domesticated the ocean. They brought it into their culture, their language, and their genealogies. The European kept the ocean at arm's length, viewing it as a place of chaos that threatened to undo the ordered, land-based civilization they valued. This profound difference in risk acceptance and environmental integration is the final non-material reason why one culture was content to hug the coastline while the other used the horizon as a constant, beckoning challenge. It was a battle won not just with wood and fiber, but with the human will. We've charted the millennia of Polynesian expansion. But to complete the historical contrast, we must briefly acknowledge the eventual convergent evolution. the later European success. The Polynesians sailed the world's largest ocean first, but Europe eventually solved the problem too. Centuries later, once the right combination of technology, incentive, and political will converged, you are now observing the docks of Lisbon or Palos in the late 15th century. You see a new type of vessel, the caravel. The mainstream historical fact is that the Portuguese development of the caravel, which successfully integrated the highly efficient lateen sail onto a robust, deep-drafted hull, was the key technological breakthrough that finally allowed Europeans to master the Atlantic and initiate the age of exploration. The caravel was fast, highly maneuverable, and, crucially, could sail effectively into the wind or beat upwind, the capability the Polynesians had enjoyed for centuries with their vaca and crabclaw sails. This simple design change liberated European sailors from the tyranny of the square sail and allowed them to make true, planned, round-trip voyages out into the prevailing, unpredictable currents of the Atlantic. This innovation was driven by necessity. Much like the Polynesian expansion, remember how the Europeans were obsessed with the spice trade? When the Ottoman Empire effectively cut off the overland routes to Asia, the economic incentive finally became powerful enough to overcome the massive societal inertia and the psychological fear of the Atlantic. The risk of the ocean suddenly became less terrifying than the certainty of financial ruin. The quirky tidbit here is that many of the initial Portuguese caravel designs were directly inspired by earlier Arab dhows and other European vessels they encountered in the Mediterranean and along the African coast, particularly in the use of the lateen sail. This highlights the idea that Europe's eventual success was not purely an endogenous invention, but an adoption and adaptation of established efficient design principles already long proven in other cultures, including those that influenced the Polynesians millennia ago. Historians still argue whether the most significant turning point in European oceanic mastery was the technological leap of the caravel, or the discovery of the wind systems, specifically the realization of the vast, predictable global GRs and the westerlies, which allowed for reliable return trips from the Americas and Africa, the Volta do Mar. The Polynesians knew their Pacific wind machine intimately. The Europeans had to discover the Atlantic machine before they could tame it. Imagine yourself as a European captain on a caravel, using your quadrant and astrolabe. But now you can actually point your ship where you want to go, even against the wind. It's a revelation. You can finally leave the coast and know, with reasonable certainty, that you can return. This sense of control is what the Polynesian navigators had been living with for 2,000 years. You probably wouldn't survive this trip on the old cog ship. You needed the caravel. Europe's delay was not a matter of ultimate inability, but of a centuries-long lack of convergence. They needed the right ship, the caravel, the right incentive, the spice route closure, and the right geographical knowledge, the Volta wind system, to align. When they did, the world changed forever. But the fact remains, when Europe finally mastered its ocean, the Polynesians had already finished colonizing theirs. The difference lies not in the final outcome, but in the timing and the motivation that drove the initial, terrifying leap. We arrive at the final corner of our journey, looking at the long-term consequence of this oceanic mastery, the shadow of isolation, the price of oceanic mastery. The very success of Polynesian voyaging eventually led to an extreme isolation that paradoxically made them vulnerable centuries later. You are standing on Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, or perhaps Hawaii, sometime in the 16th century. Your ancestors achieved the unimaginable. They found and settled the remotest corners of the earth, perfecting a culture of survival. The mainstream historical fact is that once the islands of the Polynesian Triangle were settled around 1250 AD, the era of long-distance voyaging largely ceased. The result was centuries of profound cultural and biological isolation for the individual island groups. Why did they stop? The most likely reason is simple. The colonization was complete. All habitable islands had been found and settled. Voyages from this point on would have been exponentially more difficult. The potential benefits of finding new land were massively outweighed by the risk of traversing a vast, empty ocean with no known destination. The resources, status, and energy that once went into exploration were redirected into internal development, agriculture, and local resource management. This long isolation had two major effects. First, it led to massive ecological specialization. The people of Hawaii, for instance, adapted their canoe crops, like taro, to a much larger, colder volcanic environment. The Mrori of Aotearoa adapted their entire culture, language, and technology to a temperate, massive landmass, essentially abandoning the Depotian canoe for more coastal vessels. The Rapa Nui culture, tragically, consumed its finite resources, especially timber, to sustain its population and monuments. This specialization meant that while they were perfectly adapted to their isolated home, they became brittle. The quirky tidbit here is the loss of two-way voyaging knowledge. While the skills for coastal sailing and fishing remained, the sophisticated, ritualized memory of the multi-thousand-mile round trips between archipelagos began to fade, particularly after the need for such contact ceased. The great navigational charts of the sky and swell patterns, once covering the entire Pacific, slowly shrank to cover only the area immediately surrounding the home island. The knowledge, no longer practiced, slipped from the collective memory of the new generations. Historians still argue whether the isolation was primarily responsible for the population decline and resource depletion seen on islands like Rapa Nui and the later vulnerability of all Polynesian cultures, or if that vulnerability was inevitable. Due to the limited scope of island resources, regardless of contact, what is certain is that the long isolation meant that when the European ships finally arrived centuries later, the Polynesian world was facing a massive biological shock. Imagine yourself on the shore of Hawaii, i.e. in 1778, watching the sails of Captain Cook's ships breach the horizon. You have no immunity to the common cold, smallpox, or flu that the Europeans carry. Your highly specialized isolated gene pool has never encountered these diseases. You probably wouldn't survive this exposure. This is the ultimate tragic price of having been the first and the best at Depotian colonization. Centuries of perfect isolation meant that when the two worlds finally collided, the Polynesian world suffered a catastrophic demographic collapse. The European success in sailing the Atlantic led to continuous contact, trade, and exchange, building up an immunological resilience, albeit a brutal one. The Polynesian success led to profound resource-driven isolation. The Polynesian navigators mastered the ocean, achieving the greatest feat of maritime exploration in history. But by the time the European coast huggers finally learned how to build a better boat, the advantage of having discovered the world first had been erased by the ravages of global disease and technological disparity. The Polynesian world had settled, the European world was just beginning its explosive, contagious expansion. The final image you hold in your mind is one of quiet solitude. Picture the waves still moving, the trade winds still blowing, just as they did for those thousands of years of silent isolation. The tiny islands, ringed by coral, sit alone under the vast canopy of stars that once guided the great canoes. The memory of Hawaii is now only a soft, rhythmic chant echoing across the quiet lagoons. Feel the calm of the deep night, the sense of a grand completed journey. The script ends now. We have spent the night traversing millennia, from the timidity of the Mediterranean to the audacity of the Pacific. It's time to let the echoes of those distant voyages fade. The great ships are anchored, the fires are banked, and the navigators are finally asleep. Let the knowledge you've absorbed settle gently now, a new map drawn within your own mind. There is no urgency here, only the quiet rhythm of the sea, breathing in and out. Rest well, knowing that you have journeyed with the greatest sailors the world has ever known.